Hi there, it's Matt here. Ranji, welcome back to the show. Thank you for being so gracious to return to essentially tell us the second half of the story, all about sleeping pills. For folks who may not have listened, I would implore you to go back and have a listen to our previous episode where we spoke about more generally what sleeping pills are and what they do. And then we spoke about two classes of sleeping pills: the older first generation benzodiazepines, things like Valium and Xanax. And then we spoke about the second wave of sleeping pills, which are called the non benzodiazepine hypnotics, things like Ambien and Lunesta. But now we're going to speak about some of the newer classes of sleeping pills. And perhaps I can navigate the initiation of this conversation with the melatonin receptor agonists. What are these melatonin receptor agonists and how do they function? And even though folks on this show have heard me speak about melatonin and try to explain what it is, maybe you could also just say or bake into the response of what these melatonin receptor agonists are a little bit about melatonin as well.
Sure, absolutely. Again, thank you, Matt, for having me back. It was a fun show. Yeah, we discussed benzodiazepines and benzodiazepine receptor agonists, which, as we talked about before, those classes of medications really enhance the transmission of GABA. So now we're going to pivot here and talk about a different mechanism of how we can perhaps induce sleep. So melatonin receptor agonists represent a distinct class of sleep aids that target melatonin receptors, specifically melatonin 1 and melatonin 2 receptors. Unlike medications that act on GABA receptors, which slow down brain activity to induce sleepiness. So previously, we had discussed medications that bind to GABA receptors to promote sleep by slowing down brain activity. In contrast, melatonin receptor agonists work by binding to receptors in a part of the brain known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This binding doesn't directly induce sleepiness. Rather, instead, it signals to the brain that it is time to prepare for sleep. So the natural ligand for these receptors, the natural sort of chemical for these melatonin receptors is, of course, melatonin, which is secreted by the pineal gland in response to our sleep-wake circadian rhythms. Melatonin's role is not to sedate us, but to, again, signal to the brain system process that sleep time should be approaching. And then it triggers a series of events that facilitate the onset of sleep. And so melatonin receptor agonists do the same thing by binding to these receptors. They tell the awake brain, hey, it's time to start sleeping.
And I think what's important to highlight here in this discussion, I've mentioned before that people, of course, can buy melatonin over the counter. It's not regulated, at least here in the United States, by the FDA. So you can buy it essentially as a supplement and go into grocery stores now and find it too, even pediatric forms. So one of the things there that some people may want to be thoughtful about is that the purity can vary. And there's been some studies that would suggest that what it says on the label versus what's actually in the bottle itself can be from 80% less to 460% more. There is quite a lot of variability, but one of the benefits here of these melatonin receptor agonists is that they are going to be a prescription-based form of melatonin, and therefore it is going to be reliable. It's going to be trustworthy. Am I right, and are listeners right in thinking that that's the case here?
Yeah, Matt, you're right on the money here. Ramelteon is approved by the FDA for sleep onset insomnia, but not for sleep maintenance. One of the benefits is it's very well tolerated. It comes in one dose, so it's very easy to prescribe. Recommended to take about 30 minutes before bedtime. You shouldn't use the medication within an hour of a fatty meal because it may delay the therapeutic effect. And like you mentioned, it binds potently to the melatonin receptors. It's a prescription medication, so there's a certain quality control. I know with very good certainty what I am prescribing and how much I'm prescribing. And as you just mentioned, the over-the-counter melatonin that you can buy at your local grocery stores is not FDA regulated. So I don't know anything about quality control. I don't know anything about how much melatonin or whether you are getting any melatonin at all in these over-the-counter formulations. So for that reason alone, if I'm very convinced that someone has, let's say, a circadian rhythm disruption that's leading to their insomnia, this is not necessarily an insomnia on its own, but it's a delayed sleep phase phenomenon, I really would prefer to use Rosarum to try and advance their sleep schedule. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. To compare to, let's say, the benzodiazepines or the Z drugs that we had mentioned, the side effect profile for this particular medication, the Ramelteon, includes sometimes headaches, of course, sleepiness, some dizziness and nausea can occur. Most of this is well tolerated and usually temporary. Sometimes people will say that it takes a few days for it to be effective. And I should say, sounds like we're touting Ramelteon, while it can be useful for some patients, it really tends to be useful for those patients that don't necessarily have a conditioned insomnia where there's an anxiety or a frustration that has developed over time. And it really tends to be effective in these folks that have a sort of a night owl syndrome where they have difficulty falling asleep at a particular time and waking up at a certain time. And taking this medication can sort of advance that clock a little bit earlier. And what appears to be solving insomnia is really just fixing a delayed circadian rhythm. So it's a very good medication for this.
I think it's very helpful for folks to understand why are we talking about this melatonin receptor agonist and what are we in sleep medicine, what would you be typically targeting? And what you're saying here is that when you are prescribing this, as I said, clinical grade melatonin, this reliable form of melatonin, it is being prescribed for circumstances where the ability to time sleep, not necessarily the scenario of saying, well, look, I fall asleep and then it's 3 a.m. and I always wake up. That's not really the situation that we're talking about here, where Ramelteon or this clinical grade melatonin would be used. It's in the context of circadian rhythm disruptions of sleep. Is that fairly accurate to say?
Yeah, I think that's accurate to say. I mean, there's very little GABAergic or that sort of sedating process. I'm not sedating the patient. What we would argue is in the same way that melatonin is a timing signal for the brain to help sleep, these melatonin agonists bind to these receptors and are doing the same thing to tell the brain that it's time to fall asleep. And for that reason, I like it. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see the hangover effects or impairment that you do with the benzodiazepines or the Z drugs.
Now let's shift gear to a new class of medications that actually is involved in the generation of sleep itself, or so we think, but by way of a quite unique action. And that is a classification of sleeping pills or sleeping medications called the DORAs. So DORA small s. So all caps DORA small s, standing for dual orexin receptor antagonist. What a mouthful. But what are these orexin receptor antagonist new sleep medications? And how on earth do they differ from other sleep medications? Why do we think of them as being so mechanistically, but also just conceptually different to the benzos and the non-benzos?
Yeah, they're a fun medication because of the mechanism. And
Fascinating, isn't it?
yeah, they're really fascinating.
Great story too as to how it was emerged.
Yeah. These DORAs are these, as you mentioned, dual orexin receptor antagonists are medications designed to inhibit the activity of orexin. a neuropeptide that I mentioned early on that plays a significant role in promoting wakefulness. So, by blocking the effects of orexin, something that promotes wakefulness, these medications help to manage sleep disorders by reducing wakefulness, allowing sleep to emerge. And so there are three medications in this particular class of DORAs, one of which is suvorexant, the other is lemborexant, and the last is daridorexant. And they're all closely related in their mechanisms of action and effects. And while they all share similarities in how they function and the effects they produce, they may differ in their duration of action and perhaps some side effect profiles. But really, they're just kind of me too medications. So these medications are a completely new class and they work very differently than the benzodiazepine receptor medications or the melatonin receptor agonists. And I should also mention that they are approved by the FDA for sleep onset and sleep maintenance insomnia.
You mentioned there that these three different DORA drugs, they are very, very similar. It's not like Sesame Street where one of these things is not like the other. They all three of them are very much like the other. But you did mention that there could be some subtle differences in their duration of action. And in our previous episode, you delightfully broke down the three major Z drugs, the three major non-benzodiazepine medications, and how they have a short, mid, and sort of longer term duration of action. Do we have a sense of the classification of the three DORA drugs in terms of that duration of action, or is it still a little bit unclear? You tell me.
Yeah, I can give you the half-lives of, say, the medications. So suvorexant, the half-life is about 12 hours. Lemborexant is about 17 to 19 hours, and daridorexant is about 6 to 10 hours. I've got to be honest, Matt, I've just never had any opportunity to really drill this down because they're just so new that I've chosen one and I've just been happy with the one that I've used. And I really think that it's just an opportunity for a pharmaceutical company to just tweak the molecules just a little bit and say, hey, well, this one reduces postural instability in patients that are aging compared to another one. And so I take it all with a grain of salt, but they're very similar essentially.
Gotcha. Thank you. And so, to that question of mechanism and the fascination that we both have clearly with brain mechanism, these DORA drugs, they work to promote sleep in some really interesting ways. So, maybe tell us a little bit more about maybe even what orexin is, and therefore, if you are a medication that is essentially going to be blocking that. And when we just to unpack terms for folks listening, if we speak about a drug being an agonist, we mean that it's usually going to be activating or facilitating a chemical system. Whereas if it is an antagonist, it's usually going to be inhibiting or preventing the activity of that mechanism. So here we're talking about these dual orexin receptor antagonists. So they must be blocking or reducing orexin. Tell us a little bit more about these medications and how they promote sleep and maybe some of the risks and the benefits. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled LMNT. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte mix. And for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it quite some time ago. Beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance, the other reason I'm a fan of Element is that it's scientific. And if you look at the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, and pharmacology knowledge that is baked into the product. And again, all of that comes without any sugar. I am a devotee of their product. I really do use them. I know people will say that on these ad reads. I use it every single day for my workout. I put it in my protein shakes afterwards. I do use it. Also, by the way, Element has just recently brought back the chocolate medley range, which you can have essentially your electrolytes hot. And in the trio of flavors, there is chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and also my favorite, chocolate raspberry. And by the way, I happily badgered them to agree to give you fine folks a free sample pack with any purchase of Element if you just use the link lmnt.com/Matt Walker. That's lmnt.com/Matt Walker.
As we talk about DORAs, we really need to know what orexin is. And at its core, it is a neuropeptide found in the central nervous system. We can actually measure it by taking cerebral spinal fluid, but it plays a crucial role in regulating the sleep-wake cycle. It not only promotes wakefulness on its own, but it also enhances the effects of excitatory neurotransmitters such as histamine and norepinephrine. So essentially, orexin helps maintain alertness, again, on its own, and also by augmenting the effects of these aminergic neurons and neurotransmitters, but it also stabilizes the transitions between sleep and wake states. When we talked a little bit before, we used a metaphor that the benzodiazepine receptor agonists were like enhancing the brakes of a car and slowing the brain down to fall asleep. These medications work a little bit differently. And what these medications do is that if I antagonize this orexin receptor, I'm actually reducing the wakefulness response. I'm actually sort of taking the pressure off the gas pedal to allow the system to slow down on its own. When there's a decrease in orexin levels, individuals may experience increased sleepiness and a blurring of the lines between sleep and wakefulness. And this is prominently observed in a sleep disorder we call narcolepsy, a rare but intriguing disorder characterized by an overwhelming tendency to fall asleep inadvertently during the daytime, along with phenomena like sleep-related hallucinations, sleep paralysis, cataplexy, which is basically a sudden brief loss of muscle tone while awake. And this is due to reduced orexin levels, which again, reduced orexin levels will diminish the brain's ability to keep you awake, but also to maintain a clear distinction between sleep and wakefulness. Understanding the role of orexin as a peptide that promotes wakefulness led researchers to develop a novel approach to treating insomnia. So, by blocking the receptors that orexin binds to, again, these DORAs reduce wakefulness and facilitate the onset of sleep and maintenance of sleep. These medications effectively decrease the action of orexin by decreasing wakefulness, thereby promoting sleepiness. However, if I'm inducing sort of a quasi narcolepsy state, right? So this reduced orexin state, then it goes that I may have side effects that mimic the symptoms of narcolepsy. And these are some of the terrible side effects of these DORA medications. These side effects can include cataplexy or sleep-related hallucinations or sleep paralysis, which is terrifying, as well as prolonged sleepiness during the daytime and even sudden sleep attacks during the daytime. So again, this double-edged sword, but very useful in a very novel way to help decrease wakefulness and these hyperarousal states, allowing sleepiness to be promoted in that way.
Yeah, and let me maybe just add a comment and a follow-up clinical experience question from your vast knowledge. But they are a really fascinating class of drugs. And for folks just to reaffirm how they're acting here, you've got this chemical in the brain, orexin, which essentially is going to turn on the volume or the lights on for wakefulness. And what these DORA drugs do, these three different DORA drugs, they will go in there and they will act like a set of chemical fingers that move over to that volume button on orexin wakefulness, and they'll just dial that volume of wakefulness down and down and down and down. And in some ways, then what comes in place of that now absent wakefulness is the antithesis of wakefulness, which is this thing that we call physiological sleep. So it's such a radically different way of trying to promote sleep in the brain compared with the non-benzos and the benzos. To your clinical experience, though, Ranji, do you have any sense of the severity of that daytime sleepiness? Because that's what I will hear from so many people who are using sleeping pills, that one of the biggest disadvantages is that they just feel this daytime sleepiness. It's essentially a carryover of the medication. And to the point where, for some people, maybe many people, it's just not worth it anymore to take that medication at night because of the impairment that they experience in persistent, excessive daytime sleepiness during the day. For the DORA drugs, do they produce more or less daytime sleepiness side effect ness relative to the non-benzodiazepines like Ambien? Do you have any sense of that? I know it's a completely unfair question, but just in your clinical experience and hands?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. I will have to be very honest in saying that I don't prescribe the DORAs as often as I have the Z drugs or the benzodiazepines. In my experience, what I have heard is that when people discontinue the DORAs, it is exactly for that reason, which is that I'm having a difficult time being awake during the daytime. Remember, these DORAs, their half-lives can be range from 6 to 10 hours, 12 hours, 17 to 19 hours, versus some of the Z drugs, which again can also cause some daytime impairment. Zolpidem, for example, the half-life is about 4 hours or so. For Zaloplan, it's about 1.5 hours. So you see less of that daytime, or I've experienced less of that complaint of daytime impairment with the Z drugs than I have with the DORAs.
Thank you. That's immensely helpful. And I bring that up just because it is such a prolific side effect. And of course, depending on the drug, I'm not trying to generalize there based on what you've just said. Even if it is a side effect, it seems to be one of the side effects of several that people really struggle with in terms of their tolerance, and can be an inflection side effect that pushes them away and moves them towards discontinuation of use. With all of that said, then, what other options, what other choices do you have as a physician, and could therefore patients have as a medication option, which perhaps brings us naturally onto what we call the off label sleeping pills? And these would be the things such as doxepin and trazodone. And these would be really classified in terms of the drug labeling as antidepressant medications. So tell us a little bit more about what this notion for folks out there. What does an off-label prescription approach mean in terms of its off-label nurse? And then second, could you tell us a little bit more about what these medications are, doxepin and trazodone, that are perhaps the most frequently prescribed off-label medications for sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say off label, we are referring to medications that are being prescribed that are not approved by the FDA for its indication. For example, trazodone is not approved by the FDA for insomnia. Matt, as you mentioned, doxepin, you're correct to say that it is not approved by the FDA for insomnia. However, that's based on its dose. So doxepin above 6 milligrams is not approved by the FDA for insomnia. However, doxepin at a dose of either 3 or 6 milligrams is approved by the FDA for sleep maintenance insomnia. It's a very, very subtle difference, but you basically, a pharmaceutical company went back to the drawing board and said, "Hey, we're not going to give the 10 milligram dose. We're going to give you 3 and 6 milligram dose. These are non-antidepressant doses." Went back to the FDA, did some studies safety wise, and was approved for sleep maintenance insomnia. And it is very fairly effective for patients that have sleep maintenance insomnia. So let's get back to perhaps what these are. In the case of doxepin, it's an older generation tricyclic antidepressant. Very effective at treating depression, but a lot of side effects at the higher doses. And even at the 10 milligram dose, which I'll be very honest with you, I rarely prescribe the 3 and 6 milligram dose just because it's expensive. It's very difficult for my patients to obtain this. It's just packaged differently. It's more expensive and
And
unobtainable.
is it usually in pill form or is it in liquid form?
Capsule, in fact. So theoretically, you could get a 10 milligram capsule and just throw out a half a capsule, if you will, and get 5 milligrams of the doxepin. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that you can get lower doses for a cheaper cost, get the benefits of the sedating effects without perhaps some of the side effects. But let's be honest, everything has its side effects, and doxepin is no different in that way, particularly because when we talk about doxepin and trazodone, they work differently than the medications that enhance GABA or the medications that affect melatonin receptors or the DORAs that we just described that diminish the effects of orexin. What these medications do is they really bind or antagonize receptors in the brain called histamine. So I'll briefly talk to you about trazodone. Trazodone was used very effectively for treating depression. It was a very effective depression medication, but it had to be prescribed multiple times throughout the day, but it had the effect of being sedating. And as newer antidepressant and safer antidepressants came on the market, like the SSRIs, trazodone became used less as an antidepressant and used mainly at bedtime for its sedating properties to treat insomnia. There's where we come into this off-label. Again, trazodone isn't considered by the FDA to treat insomnia, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine doesn't consider trazodone to be indicated for the treatment of insomnia. However, in clinical practice, because it's inexpensive, it's fairly well tolerated by patients, has a very low abuse potential, it's routinely prescribed. So I think the reason why these medications like trazodone or doxepin, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, and for that same matter, other types of antidepressants, other tricyclic antidepressants are used, is that they're kind of easy to prescribe. It's generic. They're not controlled substances. For some people, it works fairly well.
Just so folks know, the word trazodone may sound a little bit scary, like it's a tranquilizer, but it's really not. It's, as you said, it's going after another neurochemical system in the brain called histamine. And some people will know of the effects of blocking histamine by way of anti-allergy medications. So if you have purchased an anti-allergy medication that does not say on the box non-drowsy form, it also means that there is a drowsy form. And so what these medications are going to be doing is blocking some of that histamine, as you said. A partner of today's podcast is Shopify. Why Shopify? As someone who spends his days researching sleep and his nights researching sleep, the idea of selling merchandise was quite daunting. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to be selling? We're going to start with some exciting t-shirts, all with the proceedings going directly to a new sleep education nonprofit charity that I will announce later. At the moment that we started to do that, I knew what I wanted to design, but how on earth was I going to get this sleep merch into your fantastic hands? Everyone who gave me answers gave me the same answer, Shopify, and it turned out to be remarkably simple. Without any retail experience, I was able to set up and activate my store effortlessly. Shopify's point of sale system, it's really interesting. It basically just integrates perfectly with all of the different online sales components, and it just manages everything so smoothly. Honestly, it was great. Shopify POS, it handles all the complexities of sales, inventory, and it just lets me focus on my passion, which is sleep science. Try it out. You'll see what I mean about its intuitive platform. But you should also note that Shopify isn't just for online businesses. I've heard, at least from one friend in particular, it really can help revolutionize in-person sales as well. It's one system that seems to integrate everything. If you would like an offer, here is the offer. Shopify have agreed to do a $1 per month trial. It's just $1 a month if you do shopify.com/Matt Walker. So again, shopify.com/Matt Walker. You'll get Shopify for $1 a month. That's nuts. I don't know why they're doing this for me, but it's great. Okay, let's get back to the show. Maybe before I go any further into mechanism, could you perhaps just say a little bit more about how those medications work and also how they should be considered in terms of their side effects and their benefits too?
Yeah, you mentioned it beautifully. I think that's exactly right. Trazodone and some of these other antidepressants do block the effects of histamine, which, remember, histamine is sort of an excitatory neurotransmitter. If I block that, I'm going to make you feel a little bit sedated. Some of these antihistamines can bind in the central nervous system. And some of these other antihistamines, these newer generation antihistamines, work predominantly in the peripheral system outside of the brain. And so they're less sedating. But in the case of trazodone, its sedating properties is due to its action as an antihistamine. Also, it binds to alpha 1 adrenergic receptors, which can reduce norepinephrine neurotransmitter activity. Remember, I had mentioned that both histamine and norepinephrine are excitatory neurotransmitters. And so, if I were to antagonize or block the effects of these excitatory neurotransmitters, the effect could be decreased wakefulness and sleepiness. And that's exactly what they do. Now, their primary action is not on these particular receptors. They just happen to work on these receptors as a byproduct. Therefore, the side effect of these medications happen to be a sedating effect. But let's think about these medications as not being specific. And for this reason, the side effects are pretty varied. So I can discuss with you what the side effects of some of these antihistamines are.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. Certainly, if these are the most prescribed off label sleeping medications, then vast numbers of people listening to this will have either been made aware of them or be taking them. So I think that would be hugely helpful.
Yeah. So, in the case of trazodone, one of the big things that we have to worry about, well, one of the most common side effect is morning grogginess. This is one of the main reasons why people discontinue the medication. They just cannot feel awake. They have this inertia of sleep as they awaken. It can cause nasal congestion. But the serious concern is because it does block these alpha adrenergic receptors, they increase the chances for postural instability or the chances for dizziness, which of course can lead to falls. And given that this is one of the more common medications that are prescribed as an off label, they're routinely prescribed in clinics to our aging patients. And this is a big concern. If this medication can theoretically increase the chances for postural instability, the chances for a fall are very high. So when we think about things like doxepin, it also does have some alpha adrenergic antagonism. So again, postural instability can occur. But because the tricyclic antidepressants also block the cholinergic system as an antagonist, you will get anticholinergic side effects included. And this may include dry mouth, urinary retention, cognitive impairment, and of course, like I said, falls.
So we've been speaking here about these two off label antidepressant medications that can involve but are not exclusively related to this chemical called histamine. But now let's come on to an actual class of sleeping aids, quote unquote, which are the antihistamines. Why are the antihistamines used as sleep aids? And perhaps maybe describe why people may be familiar with the antihistamines, if they are potent or at least present in things that maybe people have taken at nighttime, and they will say, gosh, I took this medication called X, Y, and Z, and it really did seem to knock me out. Can you just give us some information on the antihistamines and why they are used as a sleep aid?
That's exactly right. I'm sure many people have used antihistamines either for allergies, or antihistamines are commonly used in nighttime cold medications to help with sleepiness, precisely because it blocks the histamine receptors, which results in sedation. So if you block the action of that particular excitatory neurotransmitter, you tend to have sedation as a side effect. To answer why they may be used primarily as a sleep aid could be due to the fact that, again, they're not considered controlled substances. So they're very easy to prescribe. They're very minimal risks with abuse or dependence or respiratory depression. So I think while people can get antihistamines over the counter, I do see a lot of clinicians relying on these antihistamine medications because they may be afraid to use controlled sedative hypnotics like benzodiazepines or benzodiazepine receptor agonists, because patients may have a history of abuse of using these particular medications or a history of using or abusing alcohol. And they want to use another route to try and help with sedating these individuals who are also having some difficulties with sleep.
And so, if that's the case, how effective are they? And tell us more about the side effects or the downsides. For example, if they have a safer side effect profile, meaning that they aren't as rife for abuse potential and their interactions with other drugs may be less significant than some of those benzo drugs, then tell us a little bit about how effective they are and any potential downsides.
It's really hard to rate the effectiveness of these antihistamines. Some antihistamines are more sedating than others, just depending on how sticky these medications will bind to these receptors, and the stickiness to the receptors and how long that stickiness may occur on the receptors. But generally, in my clinical practice, I see patients tell me oftentimes, I started, let's say, diphenhydramine, or the brand name is Benadryl, and I took one a night, then two per night, and over a few nights, it just lost its effectiveness. And I would say that it's probably because people are developing a tolerance for the antihistamines. And this goes without saying with any of the previous medications that we've described. But I think that when people are reaching out to medications over the counter, there's another problem at work here. And we've alluded to it before. It's probably a chronic insomnia. And that chronic insomnia may have evolved over time from an underlying anxiety that has to be addressed. Or it could be due to that sleep frustration that has evolved over many weeks, and now it's become conditioned. And really, it's this hyperarousal state. And these medications are going to be these antihistamines are going to be minimally effective in sort of addressing that core issue. So oftentimes, by the time they get into my office, will have tried over-the-counter supplements, including melatonin or antihistamines, and even failed other medications from other providers that have prescribed them, either controlled or off-label medications.
Yeah, and I think for folks out there, just so that you're aware, the types of things that you could buy at your pharmacy that would contain antihistamines, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Ranji, but it would be Benadryl, Advil, PM, maybe Unisom, things like NyQuil, cold and flu relief things, Nitol. Are all of those, for the most part, going to be
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
antihistamine containing categories?
Yeah, absolutely. You're either going to see two things as the key ingredient that causes sedation, either diphenhydramine or doxylamine, which are both antihistaminergic and will cause that sedation. So if someone is really reaching out to use these medications over the counter for sleep, really what they're going to try and reach out for, the key ingredient for that is diphenhydramine or doxylamine, rather than you having the cold component on top of that.
I've definitely heard of people saying, I've struggled with sleep for so many years, sometimes decades, and when sleep would get tough, I would be using these types of over-the-counter antihistamine medications. What do we know of, considering how long they've been around, of any long-term side effects of the use of these time and time again?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Madam. Apart from the sort of short-term side effects that antihistamines and medications that block cholinergic receptors, or the anticholinergics, if you will, the short-term side effects could be, particularly with the anticholinergics, an increased pressure in the eye, dry mouth, constipation, urinary retention. People often awaken saying, I'm feeling groggy, I'm not able to think as clearly. And that's because these medications are preventing the brain from functioning appropriately as it should. But in the long run, particularly drugs with anticholinergic activity, which it's very hard, by the way, to get a pure antihistamine. A lot of these medications will have antihistaminergic effects and anticholinergic effects.
Mm.
But in the long run, these has been linked to future dementia incidences, even persisting up to 20 years after exposure. And this data is, of course, based on large population-based studies and case control studies, which are perfect study designs. But I think we need to be cautious about the potential brain cognition impairments that could be potentiated by these medications in the long run. I really do stress that to my patients that, listen, we don't know the long-term effects of using these medications. And so the message that I have is, let's use what we do know at the lowest dose for the shortest amount of time if what's needed is to get you through this period.
I mean, if there is a banner statement for the appropriate ethical use of sleeping medications, I couldn't imagine a better one than that. I think that's so elegantly put. Okay, time for some honesty. I've probably eaten more protein bars in my lifetime than I've actually blinked. They've been such a constant for me throughout my life. I recently found David protein bars, and it was my friend Dr. Peter Attia who raised awareness about David. He played a key role in the development of this really quite radical new protein bar. And just hearing it from Peter, knowing his standards, that's all I needed to at least consider making the switch. And then I read about the company. They are fantastic. The bars are built on a simple, groundbreaking concept: the fewest calories for the most amount of protein, period, ever. And each bar contains a wonderful 28 grams of protein at just 150 calories. They have 0 grams of sugar as well. That is the best protein to calorie ratio that has ever been seen in a protein bar. The taste, exceptional. I almost have to ration them. They're that good, because I could probably inhale about 10 of them in one go. Protein, of course, by the way, it's critical. It's not just for building and maintaining muscles. It's for managing metabolic health, helping you feel fuller for longer. And it's that unique ratio that I think makes David protein bars, just for me at least, the most satiating that I've also ever experienced. They are fantastic. They've got 6 incredible flavors. And here's a bonus: when you buy 4 cartons, you get a 5th entirely free. If protein bars are your thing, even if they're not your thing and you're considering them, just go on over to davidprotein.com/Matt Walker. That's davidprotein.com/Matt Walker, and you will get a wonderful experience in terms of that bonus. Okay, back to the show. Maybe starting to round out here, I do think I want to just, again, for listeners, come back to these risks and side effects of all of the sleeping medications that we've spoken about. I wonder if you could reaffirm to us just a little bit more about some of the common short-term, common long-term side effects of sleeping pills? And maybe even if you were to just give the high level summation of what those would be in terms of the four classes of medications that we've essentially really covered here. We've just spoken about the antihistamines, but the benzos, the non-benzos, the DORAs, and the melatonin agonists. Just refresh our memories again, just so we have this clear, because risks and side effects, these really are a real thing with sleeping pills.
Yeah, absolutely. In the case of benzodiazepines and also the benzodiazepine receptor agonists and all the medications that we've discussed, there are certainly risks for falls. There's certainly risks for central nervous system or brain nervous system depression. There's daytime wakefulness impairment. There are concerns for withdrawing the medication and having rebound insomnia. There are, of course, in the cases of benzodiazepines and benzodiazepine receptor agonists, risk, and also the DORAs, by the way, concerns for complex sleep related behaviors and anterograde amnesia. I should say this, we really haven't discussed this much, but in the case of benzodiazepines, there's a very real risk of abuse and dependence, particularly with individuals who have had a history of abusing sedating medications or alcohol or any drug for that matter. There's an added risk of using benzodiazepines that have a very short half-life or benzodiazepines that are very potent and have a very fast onset of action. So I can't stress to you enough that when we have these conversations that we have to take that in light of not only just sort of the physical manifestations of what these medications do, but the psychological ramifications of how these medications can work. With the Z drugs or the benzodiazepine receptor agonists, of course, they have a lower potential for abuse. They still have the risk for falls, these complex sleep related behaviors, these anterograde amnesia. But again, I mean, there still exists a definitive risk for misuse. And although they typically present a reduced likelihood of physiologic dependence, compared to traditional benzodiazepines, people can become psychologically dependent on these particular Z drugs. For the dual orexin receptor agonists, the risk of misuse is lower. Again, as I mentioned, they have a high risk for having daytime wakefulness impairment. They can significantly trigger the ancillary symptoms of this narcolepsy, including cataplexy, these visual related sleep phenomenon, sleep paralysis. In the case of abuse, like I mentioned, any substance that can alter someone's perception as a means of escaping from discomfort holds potential for misuse. For the melatonin receptor agonists, on the other hand, they exhibit minimal potential for abuse or physiologic dependence. And while these medications are not commonly used for initiating sleep and are less frequently seen in clinical settings, addiction issues with these medications are exceedingly rare. But for the medications, these melatonin receptor agonists, nausea, headache are most commonly seen, which subside over periods of time. I think, Matt, ultimately, prescribing these medications requires a thorough discussion with the patient about the risks and alternatives balanced against the potential benefits. And this process is an essential part of informed consent. It involves a respectful two-way dialogue that helps minimize the risk of medication misuse. And by restricting the use of sedative hypnotics to short-term use, regularly consulting prescription monitoring programs to check for multiple prescribers, and maintaining open communication, we can somewhat safeguard against the misuse of these substances.
So importantly put and well put. I think this idea that you started with there, which is the prescription of these medications, really requires an immensely well trained clinician to understand what is the issue that you are coming to me about regarding your problematic sleep. Because in some ways, what that tells us is there isn't simply one best sleeping pill. that doesn't exist. The question is, what is the one best, or at least the first best sleeping pill for your specific circumstance? And to understand your specific circumstance, it requires that detailed, thorough clinical interviewing and understanding. So thank you for saying that. One perhaps quick point to make: many of these prescription sleeping medications, of course, have side effects that we've discussed. Tell us a little bit about who regulates them and where are the safety gates here for people listening, the patients themselves, to help make sure that they are as safely cared for under the banner of receiving one of these medications and taking these medications. Help me, or help us, understand a little bit about the regulation and where that responsibility lies.
When it comes to medications that are controlled or controlled substances, the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Agency, has a very accurate understanding of how many pills are being prescribed, who's prescribing them, and who's receiving them. And largely, this is due to protect people from being overprescribed or concerns for medications being diverted. So regulation is controlled by the DEA, but at the end of the day, it really falls in the hands of prescribers to make sure that these medications are being prescribed safely.
So, with that said, perhaps I'll just have two last questions of you. The first is, and I'm not too aware of them, but are there any emerging trends or future directions in the development of sleep medications that are starting to unfurl? Do you know?
There isn't any straightforward answer here. There's currently aren't any breakthroughs or treatments with novel mechanisms of actions on the horizon that significantly outperform the existing options,
Yeah.
at least not that I'm aware of. But pharmaceutical companies are focusing on combining existing medications to address sleep issues from different angles. For instance, they might mix a little dash of trazodone here with a little benzodiazepine here into one pill and then market as a new solution. This strategy really leans more towards marketing tactics than a genuine advancement in treatment. We've got some pretty good tools in our toolkit, and it's really not too uncommon to get it under control, especially if you sort of identify the main problem of how the insomnia has evolved. And if you proceed with CBTI, I mean, we really can get to a place with the current tools that we already have.
Yeah. And I think, on this show, we've spoken a great deal about CBTI. We've had multiple episodes on CBTI and how it works, its mechanisms, what it looks like. So for folks who are CBTI curious, and if you are struggling with your sleep, I would absolutely say it should be the first thing that you want to think about and consider, above and beyond perhaps some of the summary of key points that I think for the most part we've gathered here today. Maybe let me move on to final thoughts. What should listeners keep in mind when all is said and done regarding the consideration or the use of prescription sleeping pills? If you sort of just had a 2 minute, 3 minute spiel, it's NPR, we're coming to the news hour. I'm so unfair in doing this, but what are the final thoughts that people should keep in mind regarding the use of sleeping pills?
I just want listeners to remember that sleeping pills, they're a useful tool. They're not the be all and end all. They're just a tool for addressing difficulties with falling asleep and staying asleep. It's also exceedingly important that the preferred treatment, as you mentioned, for chronic insomnia is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. People can find practitioners through the Society of Behavioral Sleep Medicine website at behavioralsleep.org. So I wanted to mention that.
We will put that link in the show notes, behavioralsleep.org.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things is that there aren't enough CBTI providers. There just aren't enough for the demand that's out there. And there are
It is a real demand supply mismatch, isn't it?
There
If you look
really
at
is. And we there are some sleep CBT apps that are out there that are somewhat effective. I find that having a individual one-on-one experience really enhances the adherence and confidence that patients have. I think the second point to make is this: if medications are used to manage short-term insomnia, there should be a clear plan in place to eventually stop using them, ensuring that they're not a long-term solution. And so that's what I tell my patients. I say, we're going to start this, but let's also have a plan of when we're going to stop this and when the right time is. So I can sort of plant the seed that this isn't going to be a long-term solution. My last point would be this. There are some people that will have chronic insomnia where no particular identifiable trigger or source is contributing to that insomnia. They may have had horrific childhood traumatic experiences that resulted in these experiences that sleep was a very terrible thing for them. What I like to say is, for those opting for long-term medication use, maintaining an open, honest, and healthy relationship with their healthcare provider is crucial to minimizing risks and increasing the likelihood of successful treatment. I can't tell you how, when patients are really brutally honest with me and they're able to just tell me where they're coming from, I'm able to help them as best as I can. So just having that honest and healthy relationship with your provider is absolutely crucial.
Well, I think an important point on that is sleep in some ways does have a stigma around it. Some people will feel as though, am I really warranted to have
Mm,
a depthful conversation with my physician? Because it's not as though I've got cardiovascular disease or that I am moving towards type 2 diabetes. Isn't this quote unquote just sleep? And it's not just sleep.
yeah.
You have every right to seek out effective treatment and get you back on a good path. And Ronjay, I'm so glad that in our first episode, right at the top, I recall you saying it's not necessarily that your sleep system is broken. These people are not necessarily broken in that sense. But I hear so many people come to me saying, my sleep system is broken. I'm completely broken. Don't have that defeatist attitude, number one, and certainly do not feel as though you do not have the justification right to reclaim your right to a good night of sleep. And the way that you can do that is by having a completely transparent, open, straightforward, and honest conversation with your physician and hopefully your sleep physician. So thank you for saying that final point. On to my final point, and it is my final point. Where can people find and follow and learn all about you and the work that you're doing? Websites, social media handles, etc. And we will, of course, put these in the show notes too.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm on Instagram at DOC Varghese. I'm on X again at DOC Varghese. I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me at hennepinhealthcare.org. I have my clinical psychiatry practice at iit-mn.com. I'm not a big social media guy,
Right.
Matt, but I like to be available for people when they need help. And I really want to thank you, Matt, again for this opportunity to connect with you. I really respect you and what you've done to elevate the conversation around sleep, and really just providing me this platform again at scale to reach out to listeners that maybe would not be able to hear what I have to say. And so thank you. I'm immensely grateful.
Well, it is thanks in this direction to you. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, first, that I could never do this justice. That's why I knew I had to interview someone, and that someone I knew had to be you because of your wealth of knowledge, but also your warmth in terms of empathetic sensitivity and compassion to your patients, and therefore the communication to this audience as well. It's something that I really think about when I consider interviewing individuals. You are just an absolutely brilliant individual as a clinician and practicer of medicine. One of the things that frustrates me about you is the plurality of your brilliance. For folks who don't know, you actually wear many different clinical hats. This is just one of them here. I could have interviewed you on so many other topics, and you would have had equally encyclopedic knowledge and clinical practical knowledge. So, for all that you do in your medical dispensation to society, thank you again. We will link to all of the social media channels and websites that people can follow and perhaps reach out as well. Once again, Ranji, thank you for sharing your knowledge.
It was my pleasure, Matt. Thank you.